Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on the current situation in Israel for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Towards the last Israel Insider last week, we started to talk a little bit about the International Court of Justice and the case brought by South Africa on the charge of genocide against the State of Israel. There were 2 days of the case being made, first by South Africa charging Israel with genocide, and then Israel's response on the Friday. Each was allowed about 3 hours. They had multiple speakers or lawyers or legal professionals who spoke up on a variety of issues. And we're waiting to hear whether there will be any interim rulings. That's what South Africa is seeking. There was like 8 or 9, or maybe even more than that, interim rulings, like, to make Israel desist from the war, to make it do this, to make it have more humanitarian aid, etc., etc. And that's what Israel is really waiting to see what comes out of this. Obviously, Israel made a strong case dealing with the issues that this is not genocide, this is war, and people do die, and really making a really strong case for the fact that Israel has taken unprecedented, historic steps to try and alleviate civilian suffering and to make sure there's as few civilian casualties as possible. We do know, and I think I've mentioned this before, that the international average of civilians to combatant deaths in conflict is about 9 to 1. In other words, 9 civilians for every combatant killed in conflicts around the world. That's a UN number. Israel here is probably about 1 to 2.5. Obviously, it's trying as much as possible to lower the number, but as we know, Hamas use civilian population as human shields. We know that some of the Gazans have been killed by errant rockets and various other things. So Israel made a very strong case on the facts, really taking apart what was pretty much a very weak case from South Africa. It kind of really had no case. Its case was people are dying, it must be genocide. People are dying over certain people, it must be genocide. Really just regurgitating Palestinian or anti-Israel propaganda points. It wasn't serious in a court of law. The only thing that Israel was worried about is towards the end when it republished or said some of the comments which were made by Israeli politicians, but even those were either taken out of context or they were by lower level individuals who are not decision makers in any way, shape, or form. But it obviously worries the Israeli establishment. Prime Minister Netanyahu has put out a couple of press releases around the ICJ hearing, and subsequent to that, trying to get ahead of any accusations by restating some of the facts which were made in the case itself. But also one of the accusations was that Netanyahu referenced the biblical tribe of Amalek. Anyone who knows their Bible knows that they attacked the children of Israel after they left Egypt, and they were excessively brutal and basically targeted the weaker people. But there is an injunction in Judaism to remember what Amalek did to you and wipe them off from the face of the earth. And the case was made that was that call for genocide. And Netanyahu did put out a press release to the international media clarifying that is absolutely not what he was meant. He just meant to remember what they did, to hone in and recognize the atrocities of Hamas, but not to make it into any sort of genocidal comment. But it's clear that there are possible repercussions. And as I said, even though South Africa had a very weak case, it is possible, and we've seen before, that the ICJ may be highly politicized. If it's just on its merits, I think this case would have been thrown out, maybe not even heard in the first place. But it's clear that there are always politics at this level of international institutions. So Israel is really waiting to see what, if any, interim decisions could come from that, because the actual case itself will drag on for years. Obviously, that has potential diplomatic and political ramifications, but they're not immediate. The biggest worry is the interim decisions, which are supposed to be any day now. As for the war itself, as we've talked about in recent weeks, there is more and more of a move to the third stage, what's called a third stage. More and more troops and units are leaving Gaza. The north is pretty much emptying out of full units, where they really try and hold as much territory as possible. Now they're just sort of holding onto the territory, but with a far looser amount of soldiers. The center, or let's move to the south. The south, really, there's individual operations at the moment. They're trying to, if there's any Hamas rocket fire or any Hamas individuals or gangs, they try and take them out with special operations. And in the center, it's something in between what we see in the north and what we see in the south. There are still very large, troops and units in the center, but it's starting to move towards the east. But again, we're not seeing the amount of troops that we saw in the north at the beginning of the war for various reasons. What we saw today was also an unprecedented moment in this conflict, that we saw a deal for medicine between Israel and Hamas. First, I'll run through quickly what the deal was. That Israel has been pushing since the beginning of the war, and in fact, it was even part of the deal for the hostage deal, that medicine would be supplied to those hostages that need it. I understand there's around 60 of the 130 odd hostages. Again, not all 130 are still alive, but there's around 60 hostages that apparently take regular medicine. And there was a deal made with Qatar and France between on the Israeli side as well. There was Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Mossad to basically make this deal. And the deal was, for every box of medicine that would go in for an Israeli hostage, 1,000 boxes of medicines or units of medicine would then be allowed to enter the Strip. This was considered controversial because what transpired is that this deal was made only with the knowledge of the head of the Mossad and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And apparently the IDF, the defense minister, the security, and even the war cabinet, the Shin Bet, they were all completely out of the loop. They didn't hear about it until it was publicized. And then when it was publicized, one of the great victories, as the Hamas spokesman like to say, is the fact that the medicines would go into the Strip completely unchecked. And when the wider security establishment heard about that, it obviously embarrassed Netanyahu, and he quite quickly backtracked on that promise and allowed the IDF to check, or Israel to check in some way. And there was a bit of a blame game exactly what happened at this point. What we do know is that Hamas, again, according to its spokesperson, who's become a mythical figure in the pro-Palestinian street, very much saw this as a victory, as something which shows Israel's weakness, and that Israel agreed to something because of Hamas's steadfastness and really making great inroads. And if we look at the wider picture there, we can see that Hamas really do try and push out this message that Hamas is winning. It's inflicted major damage on Israel. It's inflicted major damage on Israeli society. I mean, this is even over and above what they achieved on October 7th. And they pointed very much to some Israeli commentators who have claimed, especially over the last week, because the war, let's just say, doesn't appear to be going as well as it was during the first few weeks. And I'll talk about that in a second. Some Israeli commentators have said, well, we're actually moving towards something far less than a victory, even defeat. Some Israeli commentators called it. And these messages have been really peppered around the Palestinian street and the the Hamas spokesperson has used this to show that Hamas is on the verge of a tremendous victory. And this is something which obviously Israel has to get on top of very quickly because, at the beginning of the war, it was clear that Hamas were really deflated. The Palestinian people understood that they were facing a very great defeat, but it seems that there is now a little bit of momentum back towards Hamas. Whether that's reflected on the ground is a whole other debate, and probably not. But the fact that things are not moving, particularly well at this point, or at least not as well as some would say, it's certainly playing into the hands of Hamas. Part of this is what some would describe as a lack of direction or strategy. What are the goals of this war? Obviously, we know from Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior members, they are to defeat Hamas. They are to make sure that October 7th can never happen again and return the hostages. But what exactly does that look like? Should Israel be on the Philadelphia corridor, that line between the Gaza Strip and Egypt? Does it need to completely destroy Hamas? Does it need to encircle it? Is it coming in or coming out? What is it doing in the south, where most Hamas leaders seem to have retreated to? Why are they taking so many troops out? And this has really led to quite a lot of confusion, not just amongst in Israel, but also at the higher level. So much so that Minister Gantz, who obviously, as we know, is part of the war cabinet, sent a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu with 6 points, asking him, what is your strategy? What does the day after look like? What are we doing about the Philadelphia corridor, etc., etc.? And even Chief of Staff Halevi warning that without clear strategy, the troops just simply won't be able to achieve some of the goals that were laid out. So there seems to be some uncertainty in Israel at the highest levels. Maybe I'm overstating a little bit. It's not like Israel's losing the war or anything like that, but it does seem to have slowed down from the extremely strong gains that were made in the north and even the north of the center. But now it certainly seems to have moved to a different level. Part of it probably is the international community. At the beginning of the war, when October 7th was very fresh in the minds of the international community, there was a lot of support and a lot of space given to Israel to do what it needed to do in the north, and that has certainly lessened as the pictures circulate on international media, as leaders have come out against what's happening. And there's no starker example than, let's say, the French President Macron, who at the beginning of the war even suggested that he could send troops to fight alongside Israel. Those comments were walked back pretty quickly by some other French officials, but it just shows how strongly he felt to stand alongside Israel at that point. Today, some of the comments that have been made by Macron are extremely troubling, extremely challenging for the Israeli government. So it just shows how public opinion and the international community have, I wouldn't say completely turned on Israel, but certainly amongst some of its former friends, the tone has certainly changed very much. And part of this has led to major disagreements in the Israeli cabinet. The Americans in the international community are very much pressing Israel to give the Palestinian Authority funds which it collects for taxes that it collects for the Palestinian Authority. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister from the religious Zionist party, is 100% against this, as is his colleague Itamar Ben-Gvir. But the Americans are really pushing. They believe that they found a mechanism to make sure no money goes to Hamas. But this is not really the point that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are making, that they believe the PA is complicit. It's just as bad. So giving them any money is really just funding and fueling terror. What this has led to is tonight it came out, which is no great surprise, but the fact that they came out is probably what's key, are reports that they've been offered to both Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party and Avigdor Lieberman of the Israel Beitenu party to join the coalition. Avigdor Lieberman, since the beginning of the war, he said he will join the government. All he wants is one thing. He doesn't want ministries. He doesn't want budgets. He doesn't want anything. He just wants a seat at the war cabinet table. Apparently, he may now have been offered that, but on the proviso that he remains in the government after the war. Yesh Atid apparently were offered something similar. They were offered a number of ministries. In fact, some of the ministries they were offered were ministry is currently held by members of Ben Gvir's party, which, as you can imagine, upset him very much. But again, the offer on the table was that they have to stay in the government for at least a year. Apparently, both were rejected, and now there's a bit of a blame game because one can imagine Ben Gvir wants to know what's going on. Is he going to be pushed out? But it really does serve the interests of the Likud to put these out. First of all, it looks like they're trying to enlarge the government and trying to create a unity within the country, which is something that most Israelis want. But it also looks like the people who are saying no are Lapid and Liebman. They're trying to show that it's a generous offer and all they have to do is just say yes. Clearly, though, if they would say yes, then they would be beholden to this government long after the war, which is something that would certainly serve Netanyahu and serve the longevity of his rule and his government. Even if Ben Gvir decided to leave, even if Smotrich left, the numbers would be there for a very stable government, and that definitely serves Netanyahu's interests at this stage. So it doesn't seem like these offers were even close to what these two parties can get on board with. But we'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks. Just a final note, the budget was passed through the government and now it's going through the Knesset. Interestingly, we do actually see a little, at the moment, minor rebellion from certain Likud backbenchers who are sitting on the committees that need to pass it through the legislative process. So again, this could be something big or it could be just something small, but it does seem like a flexing of the muscles from some of the Likud backbenchers. So a lot for Netanyahu to deal with in the days and weeks ahead, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you so much. The first question is from Carrie Hillebrand asking, under the Qatar brokered agreement, what assurances does Israel have that the proper medications will be received by the captives and that they will be properly administered?
That's a very good question that a lot of Israelis are asking, and there are no answers. There doesn't seem to be a proof mechanism. There are suggestions that the Red Cross or the Qataris themselves could provide that evidence, but it doesn't seem like there are such mechanisms. So really, some of the hostage families are asking, how do we know that they were delivered? How do we know this is not a scam? And it again just shows the uncertainty or unease that many people feel with this particular deal because it seems to have been rushed through without what some would say are the proper mechanisms of proof for that, but also in the checking of all the packages and deliveries and the lorries that are going in to Gaza with the medicines for the Gazan people. So that remains to be seen.
Thank you. Brock Korkmaz asks, do you think Israel should control the southern bank of the Litani River?
That would mean, again, occupying southern Lebanon. That's not something that too many Israelis are countenancing. There is more of a growing drumbeat that there will need to be a war. In fact, Herzliya Levy did come out and say that the likelihood of a war with Hezbollah is just growing and growing week by week. And it does seem like that's the case, but I don't think anyone's really talking about long-term occupation. What they are hoping for is either through diplomacy or through military action to push Hezbollah back behind the Litani River, but not for Israel to occupy southern Lebanon.
Thank you. David Levine asked, Netanyahu has repeatedly said that Israel must become independent in access to ammunition and not have to rely on the continued goodwill of the U.S. Is Israel currently capable of ramping up manufacture of the ammunition that it needs now in the Gaza war?
I mean, I've never heard Netanyahu say that. He probably thinks it, like most Israelis would, but there's been a long-standing relationship. The military aid that Israel gets, much of it is contingent on being spent in America. The American security and military industry, and I think it suits the Americans that Israel has to ask for a lot of this ammunition, rockets, and the rest of it, because then that can be conditioned. There have been lots of attempts in the past for Israel to create an industry in certain areas that it does outsource it, let's just say, to other countries. But there's been a diplomatic price to be paid for that. So usually it doesn't really get off the ground. I'm sure most Israeli leaders would like that to happen, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't think that there's anything being done to alleviate that situation in the near future.
Thank you. Michael asked, to what extent is there currently a true coalition government, or to what extent is Netanyahu still in charge?
Well, I mean, he's always been in charge ever since he's been in power. He's basically moved the decision-making mechanisms, or let's say narrowed the amount of people who are part of it, and made sure that he was stacked the numbers very much that he makes the final decision. There is, in theory at least, we have a coalition government, we have a parliamentary system, and it does mean that the parliament is supposed to be of greater power, and the government is supposed to be a government, first, and Netanyahu is supposed to be first amongst equals. But as I think I've said previously, we've very much been moved to a presidential system without too many people paying attention, because power is very much invested in the position of prime minister, and that's something which Netanyahu himself has been very keen to do, and make sure that all the decision-making bodies are either ruled by him or with a majority of people loyal to him. And some of the decisions, as we saw today with the medicine, don't even go through the appropriate channels. So very much Netanyahu is the decision maker. Some things he's legally has to go through, whether it's the Knesset or the Security Cabinet or the War Cabinet, but as much as possible, he tries to ensure that the final decisions are very much his.
Thanks. Mirna asks, with all the information flooding the air by Hamas, how does Israel see this problem, and what solution is there to counteract this propaganda information war?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not really privy to what Israel is doing in the cyberspace. I'm assuming it is. Israel does officially have some very strong Arabic language channels. Whether they are trusted or read by Palestinians, let alone the wider Arab region, is open to debate. The numbers, I saw a poll, I think it was last week, that the numbers haven't really moved. They're very much solidly on the side of the Palestinian narrative, let's say, both in terms of what happened on October 7th and since. But I'm assuming that there are some efforts to try and change this. But the truth is that much of what sort of shapes the perception, not just on the Palestinian street, but around the Arab world, is what happens in Al Jazeera. And that's not something that Israel has acted against. There was talk about shutting it. I think even some mechanisms were created to close. When I say close Al Jazeera, close it at least in Israel. It's still operating legally in Israel. It's not operating in certain countries like Egypt. So Israel, could justifiably make the case to close it in Israel, but it has not done so. Probably at the request and the behest of the Qataris, who, as I've made clear, are very much part of this process, acting very strongly as the mediators, intermediaries between Israel and Hamas because of their relationship with Hamas. So I think that pretty much their demands are being met, and part of that at this point means the non-shuttering of Al Jazeera in Israel, which certainly, while it wouldn't stop the propaganda from Al Jazeera, would at least lessen it. We saw a week or two ago Al Jazeera correspondents in Israel basically propagating the Palestinian or even the Hamas narrative against Israel, which no right-thinking country would really countenance, especially in a time of war. But it continues.
Absolutely. Harvey Treisen asks, Gaza is a sideshow to the big issue, Iran versus the West. When will Israel be relieved from the fighting this battle alone?
Well, it's not just Iran versus the West, it's Iran versus the pragmatic Arab world as well, led by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other countries. What we're seeing is, let's say, for example, where the West is most active is supposedly at the in the Red Sea, trying to prevent the Houthis from shooting missiles at ships, shipping lanes, and they continue to do so, despite the fact that there's, I think, a 12-nation coalition with some of the biggest, strongest ability, missile capability, air force capability in the world. Some of the biggest, cruise ships or whatever, not cruise ships, military ships. And so far, they haven't been able to stop the Houthis. And in fact, the only really action that's been taken is, or largely has been defensive. This is sending a very strong message to Iran that the West hasn't got the stomach for a fight. It does not want to fight, almost at all costs. If one of the major shipping lanes, which is causing a massive rise in the cost of goods around the world, is having a major knock-on effect for financial institutions around the world, is being stopped by basically, a terrorist organization in part of Yemen. Iran is thinking, well, if the West can't even take them on, then we feel pretty safe at this moment. So the Iranians probably do feel pretty secure at the moment. The West has no stomach for taking them on, certainly not head on, or even even one of its proxies at the moment. It is very much trying to solve it through diplomacy, through other ways, but the Iranians are quite simply just, denying their culpability in this and just, trying to act like they do all around the region and, at arm's length. But we did see this week, again, something relatively unprecedented, that Iran did shoot missiles at two sovereign neighbors in Pakistan and Iraq. And the international response was met with a shrug. I can't remember the last time a country completely that was not attacked just decided to attack on one day two sovereign neighbors and barely a whimper from the international community. So again, Iran is looking at this and looking at the response from the international community and thinking that it pretty much has a free rein at this point.
Very good point. J.R. Pride asks, if the ICJ rules against Israel, be it the initial ruling, what would be the international consequences if Israel ignores any rulings?
Well, I mean, the ICJ's rulings are in theory binding, but they don't have an army. They don't have a mechanism. As opposed to the ICC, they don't have any arrest warrants. The ICC can actually put out international arrest warrants. ICJ's ruling are binding, but if the parties do not listen to it, then it hasn't really got too much recourse, other than some of the parties then taking it to the General Assembly or the Security Council, basing themselves on that decision. Obviously, we know the General Assembly, anything that involves Israel will get an absolute automatic majority, even if there is no ICJ ruling. So nothing will change there. The question is what the Americans would do in the Security Council, whether they would use their veto or not, because it's one thing to use its veto to stop, to prevent an immediate ceasefire, but it's another thing to do it on the back of the ICJ ruling that there should be an immediate ceasefire. So really the ball would be very much in the Americans' court. Israel, or at least, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that regardless of any ruling, Israel will continue fighting till it's achieved its goals. So that's fighting talk, but it's easier to say this than, if there was a ruling. So we'd have to wait and see, but a lot would depend on the US's role in this.
Thank you. And you said that Israel is closing up or ending or moving on to stage three, the third stage. What exactly does this look like in the coming weeks?
So it looks like far less forces in Gaza. Again, Israel understands that it can't keep, military people who are, have lives, have businesses in Gaza indefinitely. So they're trying very much to allow them to move home. Even some of the regular soldiers to have maybe a week off or a few days off. The whole Golani Brigade was let off this week, but a lot of these people are being told that we can and or will call you back within weeks. And so Israel is trying to do as much as it can with a smaller fighting force, partly because of its own practical, pragmatic needs, as I've just laid out, but partly because the international community, led by the US, is trying to press Israel into or against some of the actions that it took in the north, which led to a far quicker, let's say, victory or taking over the space in the north. But it cost a lot of Palestinian lives. This is something which the international community, led by the US, does not want to see. And the fact that A lot of the people in the north and the center have moved south, means the concentration of civilians is even greater, but so are the number of Hamas high level and low level terrorists. So it's going to mean a far longer stage, but it will involve less troops, less regular operations, and maybe more low key, I wouldn't say low key, but more special operations, specifically trying to target Hamas sites and trying, as much as possible not to kill any civilians while doing so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.